Lady Victoria Ashworth stepped out of her golden carriage with the grace of someone who believed the entire world existed for her pleasure. Her silk dress, worth more than most people earned in a lifetime, rustled softly as she adjusted her jeweled tiara. The massive iron gates of Whitmore Palace loomed before her, but she barely glanced at them. After all, she had been here countless times before as a guest of the royal family. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard as Victoria made her way toward the main entrance. Her heels clicked against the stones with authority, each step announcing her presence to anyone within earshot. She had always enjoyed the way people looked at her when she walked past, some with admiration, others with envy, but all with recognition of her status. Behind her, 3 servants struggled with her numerous bags and packages from her morning shopping expedition. Victoria had spent the equivalent of a teacher's yearly salary on a single necklace, and she felt absolutely no guilt about it. Money was meant to be spent, especially when you had as much of it as she did. As she approached the palace entrance, Victoria noticed the guards standing at attention. These weren't the usual faces she was accustomed to seeing. The royal family must have hired new security personnel. She barely acknowledged them with a nod, expecting them to immediately recognize her importance and step aside. However, the lead guard, a tall man with stern eyes and an immaculate uniform, stepped forward with his hand raised. His voice was firm but respectful as he spoke. "Good morning, madam. I'll need to see your invitation or appointment documentation before you can enter the palace grounds." Victoria stopped walking and stared at him with complete disbelief. Her perfectly manicured eyebrows arched high as she processed what she had just heard. No one had ever asked her for documentation before. The very idea was absurd. She was Lady Victoria Ashworth, daughter of the wealthiest merchant family in the kingdom, personal friend of Princess Catherine, and a regular at every important social gathering in the capital. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice dripping with indignation. "I am Lady Victoria Ashworth. I don't need documentation to enter this palace. I'm practically family here." The guard remained unmoved by her declaration. His training had taught him to treat everyone equally, regardless of their claims or appearance. "I apologize, my lady, but palace security protocols require documentation from all visitors, without exception. If you have an appointment, surely you must have received some form of confirmation." Victoria's face began to flush red with anger. How dare this common guard question her right to enter the palace? She had attended Princess Catherine's birthday celebration just 2 weeks ago. She had danced with visiting princes and discussed politics with ambassadors. The idea that she needed permission to enter was not just insulting, it was completely ridiculous. "Do you have any idea who I am?" she demanded, her voice rising several octaves. "My family has been friends with the royal family for generations. I've had tea with the Queen herself on numerous occasions. I absolutely do not need your permission or anyone else's permission to enter this palace." The other guards exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating situation. They could see that this woman was obviously wealthy and well-connected, but their orders were crystal clear. No exceptions meant no exceptions, regardless of who was asking. The lead guard maintained his professional composure despite Victoria's increasingly hostile tone. "I understand your frustration, my lady, but I'm simply following direct orders from the palace administration. If you could perhaps contact someone inside who can verify your visit, we would be happy to escort you in immediately." Victoria's anger reached a boiling point. The suggestion that she needed someone to vouch for her was the final insult. She had never been so humiliated in her entire privileged life. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides as she glared at the guard with pure hatred. "I will not be treated like some common peasant seeking charity," she hissed through gritted teeth. "You clearly don't understand the gravity of your mistake. When I speak to the Queen about how her guards treated me today, you'll be lucky if you're still employed by sunset." The threat hung in the air like a storm cloud, but the guard remained steadfast in his duty. He had faced down angry nobles before, and he knew that maintaining protocol was more important than avoiding temporary conflict. His job was to protect the palace and everyone in it, not to make exceptions for people who claimed special privileges. Victoria looked around the courtyard, noticing that several other people had stopped to watch the confrontation. Palace staff, Other visitors and even some of the other guards were all staring at her. The attention only made her angrier. She was used to being the center of attention, but not like this. Not as someone being denied entry like a common criminal. Her eyes fell on the sword hanging at the guard's side. It was an ornate ceremonial blade, polished to a mirror shine and decorated with the royal coat of arms. The sight of it gave her an idea, a terrible, impulsive idea that would soon change everything. Victoria's mind raced with indignation and desperation. She had never been denied anything in her life, and she wasn't about to start now. The ceremonial sword at the guard's side seemed to mock her with its gleaming surface. An wild idea formed in her head. If these guards wouldn't recognize her authority through words, perhaps she needed to demonstrate it through action. Without warning, Victoria lunged forward with surprising speed for someone wearing such an elaborate dress. Her hand shot out and grasped the handle of the guard's sword, attempting to pull it from its sheath. The metal sang as it slid partway out, catching everyone in the courtyard completely off guard. "If you won't show me the respect I deserve," she shouted, her voice echoing off the palace walls, "then perhaps this will remind you of who you're dealing with." The guard reacted instantly, his training kicking in despite his shock at the unexpected assault. His strong hand clamped down over hers on the sword handle, preventing her from drawing it completely. The other guards immediately moved to surround them, their own hands moving to their weapons as they assessed the threat level. "Release the weapon immediately," the lead guard commanded, his voice no longer polite but filled with authority and warning. His grip tightened around her delicate fingers, applying just enough pressure to make her wince without causing real harm. Victoria struggled against his hold, her face contorted with rage and embarrassment. She could hear gasps and murmurs from the growing crowd of onlookers. Palace servants had stopped their work to stare at the incredible scene unfolding before them. Some covered their mouths in shock, others whispered urgently to each other about what they were witnessing. "Let go of me!" Victoria shrieked, trying to twist her wrist free from the guard's iron grip. "You have no right to touch me. I am Lady Victoria Ashworth, and I demand to be treated with proper respect." But her struggles only made things worse. The more she fought, the more ridiculous she looked. Her carefully arranged hair began to come loose from its pins, and her expensive dress was becoming wrinkled and disheveled. The picture of elegance she had presented just moments before was rapidly dissolving into chaos. Captain Reynolds, the head of palace security, had been alerted by the commotion and came running from his office. He was a veteran of many conflicts and had dealt with difficult visitors before, but he had never seen anything quite like this. A noblewoman attempting to steal a guard's sword was definitely a first in his long career. "What exactly is happening here?" Captain Reynolds demanded as he approached the struggling pair. His weathered face was stern, and his hand rested on his own sword hilt as he evaluated the situation. The lead guard, still maintaining his grip on Victoria's hand, quickly explained the situation. "Sir, this lady attempted to enter the palace without proper documentation. When we asked her to follow protocol, she became hostile and tried to take my sword." Victoria's eyes blazed with fury as she heard her actions described in such simple terms. "That's not what happened at all," she protested. "These incompetent guards don't know who I am. I'm a personal friend of the royal family, and I don't need anyone's permission to enter this palace." Captain Reynolds studied Victoria carefully, taking in her expensive clothing and jewelry. He could see that she was clearly wealthy, but that didn't excuse her behavior. In his experience, entitled nobles often caused more problems than common criminals because they believed rules didn't apply to them. "I don't care if you're the Queen's own sister," Captain Reynolds said coldly. "No one draws a weapon on my guards without facing consequences. Lady or not, you've just committed assault against a palace guard." The weight of those words hit Victoria like a physical blow. Assault? The term seemed impossibly harsh for what she considered a minor gesture of frustration. She had simply grabbed a sword to make a point, not to hurt anyone. Surely they couldn't be serious about treating this as a real crime. "This is absurd," she sputtered, her voice becoming shrill with panic. "I wasn't going to hurt anyone. I was simply trying to get their attention. You can't seriously be considering this assault." But Captain Reynolds was deadly serious. Palace security was not a game, and threatening a guard was one of the most serious offenses possible. The fact that Victoria was a noblewoman made the situation more complicated politically. But it didn't change the fundamental facts of what had happened. The crowd in the courtyard had grown larger, with people craning their necks to get a better view of the unprecedented drama. Whispers spread quickly through the gathered servants and visitors. Some recognized Victoria from previous palace events, which made the spectacle even more shocking. The pampered socialite they remembered from elegant dinner parties was now red-faced and disheveled, struggling with palace guards like a common troublemaker. Victoria became aware of all the staring eyes and felt a new wave of humiliation wash over her. These people would remember this moment forever. They would tell stories about the day they saw Lady Victoria Ashworth make a complete fool of herself at the palace gates. Her reputation, so carefully cultivated over years of social climbing, was crumbling with each passing second. The sword finally slipped from Victoria's weakening grip and slid back into its sheath with a metallic whisper. Her hand was red and sore from the guard's firm hold, and she cradled it against her chest, while glaring at everyone around her with wounded pride. The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in, but her stubborn nature refused to let her admit any wrongdoing. Captain Reynolds gestured to two of his men, who moved to flank Victoria on either side. Their presence wasn't threatening, but it made it clear that she was no longer a free agent in this situation. The captain's expression remained stern as he considered his options. Palace protocol demanded that anyone who threatened a guard be detained and questioned, regardless of their social status. "Lady Ashworth, I'm going to need you to come with us for questioning," Captain Reynolds announced. "Your actions here today constitute a serious breach of palace security, and we cannot simply let you walk away." Victoria's mouth fell open in disbelief. The idea that she might actually be arrested was so foreign to her privileged worldview that she couldn't immediately process it. "You cannot be serious," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I am a guest of the royal family. You cannot treat me like some common criminal." "Your social connections don't grant you immunity from the law, my lady," Captain Reynolds replied, firmly. "If you had simply followed proper procedures, none of this would have been necessary. But once you laid hands on that sword, you crossed a line that I cannot ignore." The crowd of onlookers continued to grow, and Victoria could see palace servants peering down at them from windows high above. News of the incident was spreading through the palace like wildfire. She imagined the gossip already beginning to circulate among the staff, and from there it would surely reach the ears of the nobility. By evening, everyone in high society would know about her humiliation. One of Victoria's servants, a nervous young man named Thomas who had been carrying her packages, finally found the courage to step forward. "Please, sir," he said to Captain Reynolds, wringing his hands anxiously. "Lady Victoria is truly a friend of Princess Catherine. Perhaps if we could send word to Her Royal Highness, this misunderstanding could be cleared up quickly." Captain Reynolds considered this suggestion. If Victoria really was a close friend of the princess, then arresting her could create significant political complications. But he also couldn't simply take the word of a servant, and Victoria's own behavior had hardly been that of someone with genuine connections to royalty. "Very well," he decided. "We'll send a message to Princess Catherine's private secretary. If Lady Victoria's claims are verified, we can handle this matter more diplomatically. However, until we receive confirmation, she will need to remain in palace custody." Victoria felt a small surge of relief. Surely Princess Catherine would vouch for her. They had attended the same finishing school and had been friends for years. Catherine would straighten out this entire mess with a single word, and then these guards would realize just how badly they had misjudged the situation. But as they waited for a response from the princess's quarters, doubt began to creep into Victoria's mind. When was the last time she had actually spoken with Catherine? Had it been at the birthday celebration 2 weeks ago, or was it longer than that? She tried to remember their last conversation, but realized with growing unease that most of their recent interactions had been brief pleasantries at formal events. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Victoria stood between the two guards, acutely aware of how ridiculous she must look to everyone watching. Her elaborate hairdo had completely fallen apart, leaving strands hanging around her face. Her dress, which had cost more than most people's homes, was wrinkled and had a small tear where she had struggled with the guard. Finally, a young palace page arrived with a sealed message. Captain Reynolds opened it and read the contents, his expression remaining carefully neutral. Victoria watched his face intently, searching for any clue about what Princess Catherine had said. Surely it would be good news. Surely Catherine would remember their friendship and put an end to this nightmare. Captain Reynolds folded the message and looked directly at Victoria. His eyes held no warmth, only professional duty. I'm afraid Princess Catherine's secretary reports that Her Royal Highness has no appointment scheduled with you today, and no record of any recent social contact. Furthermore, the princess is currently traveling abroad and has been for the past 10 days. The words hit Victoria like a slap across the face. Princess Catherine wasn't even in the country. Her supposed close friend, the person she had counted on to rescue her from this humiliation, had been gone for over a week without Victoria even knowing about it. The realization of how tenuous her connection to the royal family actually was came crashing down on her. That can't be right, Victoria stammered, but even as she spoke, she knew it was true. She had been so focused on her own social calendar and shopping expeditions that she hadn't paid attention to what was happening in Catherine's life. Their friendship, which she had always assumed was mutual and important, was apparently much more one-sided than she had realized. The crowd of onlookers seemed to sense the shift in Victoria's circumstances. Some began to whisper more loudly, no longer concerned about showing respect to someone who was clearly not as important as she had claimed to be. The servants who had recognized her from previous events looked confused and embarrassed, as if they were seeing her clearly for the first time. Captain Reynolds tucked the message into his coat pocket and nodded to his guards. The situation had become much clearer now that Victoria's claims had been thoroughly debunked. Without royal protection or genuine connections, she was simply another privileged citizen who had broken the law and would have to face the consequences like anyone else. Lady Victoria Ashworth, he announced in a formal tone that carried across the courtyard. You are under arrest for assault against a palace guard and attempted theft of a weapon. You will be escorted to the palace detention facility for processing. Sew. Words under arrest seemed to echo endlessly in Victoria's ears. Her legs felt weak beneath her, and she had to grab onto one of the guard's arms to keep from falling. This couldn't be happening. People like her didn't get arrested. They had lawyers and connections and family influence to protect them from such common indignities. Wait, she pleaded, her voice cracking with desperation. Please, there must be someone else you can contact. What about Lord Pemberton? He knows my family very well. Or perhaps the Duke of Westshire. My father has done business with him for years. Captain Reynolds shook his head firmly. The time for making excuses has passed, my lady. Your actions today speak louder than any character. Preferences. You will have the opportunity to contact your family's legal representatives once you've been properly processed. As the guards began to escort her toward a side entrance of the palace that led to the security offices, Victoria's mind raced frantically. She tried to think of anyone, absolutely anyone, who might be able to help her out of this situation. But as she mentally reviewed her social connections, she began to realize how shallow most of them really were. The people she thought of as friends were really just acquaintances who attended the same parties and social events. They knew her as the wealthy daughter of a successful merchant family, someone who could afford expensive gowns and jewelry. But did any of them actually care about her as a person? Would any of them risk their own reputations to help her now that she was in real trouble? The detention facility turned out to be a small but secure area in the palace's lower level. It wasn't a dungeon by any means, but it was certainly nothing like the luxury Victoria was accustomed to. The walls were plain stone, the furniture was basic and functional, and there were no decorative touches whatsoever. For someone who lived surrounded by silk and gold, the starkness was almost overwhelming. A female guard searched Victoria's belongings, confiscating her jewelry and personal items according to standard procedure. Watching her expensive necklaces and bracelets being catalogued and locked away felt like losing pieces of her identity. These weren't just accessories to her. They were symbols of her status and worth in the world. "This is all a terrible mistake," Victoria kept repeating to anyone who would listen. "When my father hears about this, there will be serious consequences. The Ashworth family has significant influence in this kingdom, and we will not tolerate this treatment." But her threats fell on deaf ears. The palace guards had dealt with angry nobles before, and they knew that most of the time families were more embarrassed by their relatives' behavior than willing to make a public fuss about the consequences. The last thing wealthy families wanted was their dirty laundry aired in public courts. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Victoria sat on the simple wooden bench in her holding cell, still wearing her wrinkled and torn dress, and tried to process what had happened to her. She had woken up that morning as Lady Victoria Ashworth, confident socialite and member of high society. Now she was a criminal defendant facing serious charges. The irony of her situation wasn't lost on her. She had grabbed the guard's sword because she felt she wasn't being treated with sufficient respect. But her actions had resulted in her being treated with no respect at all. She had demanded to be recognized for her importance, and instead she had demonstrated her complete lack of real power or influence. As the day wore on, Victoria began to overhear conversations between the guards about her case. They spoke about her as if she weren't there, discussing the charges and the likely legal proceedings. The casual way they talked about her future was terrifying. To them, she was just another case file, not a person whose life was being turned upside down. "First-time offense," one guard mentioned to another. "Probably get a fine and community service if her family has good lawyers. But the assault charge is serious. Could be looking at jail time." Jail time. The phrase sent ice through Victoria's veins. The idea of being locked up with common criminals was so horrifying that she felt physically sick. She had visited friends in hospital rooms that were probably more luxurious than whatever cell they might put her in. Finally, late in the afternoon, Captain Reynolds returned with news. Victoria jumped to her feet eagerly, hoping that her father's lawyers had somehow worked a miracle and secured her release. But the expression on the captain's face told her that the news wasn't good. "Your family has been contacted," he informed her. "Your father's legal representative will be here first thing tomorrow morning. Until then, you'll remain in custody. The charges are too serious for simple bail, given the location and nature of the offense." Victoria sank back onto the bench, feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her life. Her father, the man who had always been able to fix any problem, with money or influence couldn't even get her out of a palace holding cell. The full weight of her actions was finally beginning to settle on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. The night in the palace detention facility was the longest of Victoria's life. The simple cot was nothing like her silk-sheeted four-poster bed at home, and the thin blanket provided little comfort against the stone wall's chill. Every sound echoed in the small space, from the guard's footsteps in the corridor to the distant chiming of the palace clock tower marking each torturous hour. Unable to sleep, Victoria found herself replaying the day's events over and over in her mind. Each time she remembered grabbing for the guard's sword, she felt a fresh wave of shame and regret. What had possessed her to do something so reckless? In her pampered world, she had never faced real consequences for her behavior, so she had never learned to control her impulses when things didn't go her way. As dawn broke through the small window, Victoria realized she looked absolutely terrible. Her once perfect appearance was completely ruined. Her hair was tangled, her makeup had smeared and faded, and her expensive dress looked like she had slept in it, which she had. For someone who had always taken pride in her flawless presentation, seeing herself in such a state was another blow to her crumbling self-image. Shortly after breakfast, a stern-looking man in an expensive suit arrived at the facility. Victoria recognized him immediately as Mr. Harrison, her father's chief legal advisor. She had met him at various family business functions, but had never paid him much attention. Now he represented her only hope of escaping this nightmare with some dignity and tact. Mr. Harrison's expression was deeply disapproving as he reviewed the charges against Victoria. He had spent decades protecting the Ashworth family's interests, but he had never had to deal with anything quite this embarrassing. Assault charges against a member of one of the kingdom's wealthiest merchant families would create exactly the kind of scandal that could damage business relationships for years to come. "Lady Victoria," he said once they were seated in a small conference room, "I need you to understand the gravity of your situation. The palace guards have multiple witnesses to your actions, including several members of the palace staff who recognized you from previous visits. There is no question about what happened. The only question is how to minimize the damage." Victoria listened with growing horror as Mr. Harrison explained the potential consequences she was facing. The assault charge alone could result in significant jail time, and the attempted theft of a weapon from a palace guard was considered an act against the crown itself. Even with the best legal representation money could buy, she was looking at months or possibly years of imprisonment. "But surely, there's something we can do," Victoria pleaded. "My family has influence. We've donated large sums to various royal charities. There must be some way to make this go away quietly." Mr. Harrison shook his head grimly. "Your father has already attempted to use every connection available to him. However, the palace security department operates independently from the social circles your family moves in. Captain Reynolds has made it clear that he intends to prosecute this case to the full extent of the law, regardless of any outside pressure." The reality of her situation was beginning to penetrate Victoria's defenses. She wasn't just going to receive a slap on the wrist and a stern lecture. She was facing real, serious consequences that could destroy her comfortable lifestyle forever. The thought of spending years in prison, cut off from everything she had ever known, was almost too terrifying to contemplate. However, Mr. Harrison did have one possible option to present. "There is one alternative that has been offered," he said carefully. "Given your lack of prior criminal history and your family's standing in the community, the prosecutor is willing to consider a plea arrangement. Instead of jail time, you would face a substantial fine, a lengthy period of community service, and a formal public apology." At first, the idea of a public apology seemed almost as horrifying as jail time to Victoria. She imagined herself standing before crowds of people admitting that she had been wrong and asking for forgiveness. The humiliation would be enormous and everyone in her social circle would know about it. But as Mr. Harrison continued explaining the details, Victoria realized it was her only realistic option. The community service would involve working with organizations that helped people less fortunate than herself, something she had never done in her privileged life. She would be required to spend several hundred hours over the next 2 years actually helping others instead of simply writing checks to charity. "I need time to think about this," Victoria said weakly, though they both knew she had no real choice. The alternative was too awful to consider. "I'm afraid time is a luxury you don't have," Mr. Harrison replied. "The prosecutor wants an answer by this afternoon. If you refuse the plea arrangement, they will proceed with the full charges immediately." As Victoria sat alone in the conference room, she began to understand that her old life was over regardless of which option she chose. If she went to jail, she would lose everything: her social standing, her comfortable lifestyle, and possibly even her family's support. But if she accepted the plea deal, she would have to admit publicly that she had been wrong, and she would be forced to spend time with people she had always considered beneath her notice. For the first time in her life, Victoria was forced to confront the possibility that maybe she really had been wrong. Maybe the guards had simply been doing their jobs when they asked for her documentation. Maybe her sense of entitlement had blinded her to the rights and dignity of other people. Maybe the person she had always believed herself to be, important, special, deserving of deference, was nothing more than a spoiled child who had never grown up. The thought was painful, but it was also strangely liberating. If she could admit that she had been wrong, perhaps she could also learn to be different. 3 months later, Victoria stood in the kitchen of St. Mary's Shelter for Women, her hands covered in flour as she helped prepare dinner for dozens of homeless women and children. Her designer clothes had been replaced with simple, practical garments suitable for manual work. Her perfectly manicured nails were now short and often dirty from the various tasks she performed during her community service hours. The public apology had been every bit as humiliating as she had feared. Standing before a crowd of reporters and palace officials, Victoria had formally acknowledged her wrongdoing and expressed sincere regret for her actions. The story had been front-page news for several days, and she had become a cautionary tale about entitled nobility throughout the kingdom. But something unexpected had happened during those painful months of community service. As Victoria worked, alongside people who had experienced real hardship, women who had lost their homes, children who didn't know where their next meal would come from, elderly people who had no one to care for them, she began to see the world through different eyes. Maria, a young mother who lived at the shelter with her 2 small children, had become something of a mentor to Victoria, though neither of them would have expected such a relationship when they first met. Maria had initially been suspicious of the wealthy lady who had been sentenced to work at the shelter, assuming Victoria would be condescending and useless. Instead, she found someone who was genuinely eager to learn and help, even if she was incredibly clumsy at first. "You're getting better at that," Maria commented as Victoria successfully kneaded a batch of bread dough without making a complete mess of the counter. "Remember when you first tried to cook eggs and nearly burned down the kitchen?" Victoria laughed, a sound that had become much more frequent and genuine over the past months. The laughter was different now, not the sharp social laughter she had used at parties, but something warm and real. "I still can't believe I thought cooking was just something poor people did because they couldn't afford servants." The change in Victoria's perspective had been gradual but profound. Working directly with people who struggled to meet their basic needs had shown her how disconnected she had been from the reality most people lived with every day. She had spent her entire life surrounded by luxury while remaining completely ignorant of how the vast majority of people actually survived. Even her relationship with her family had changed. Her father, initially furious about the scandal Victoria had brought upon the Ashworth name, had been surprised to see the positive changes in his daughter's character. She no longer demanded constant shopping trips or threw tantrums when she didn't get her way. Instead, she had started asking questions about their family's business practices and suggesting ways they could better support their employees. Captain Reynolds had visited the shelter one afternoon to check on Victoria's progress as part of the court's monitoring requirements. He had expected to find a sullen, resentful woman doing the minimum required work while counting down the days until her sentence was complete. Instead, he discovered someone who had genuinely embraced her community service and was making a real difference in the lives of others. "I owe you an apology," Victoria had said to him during his visit. "Not just for what I did at the palace, but for the person I was before that day. I thought I was better than other people because my family had money, but I was really just ignorant and selfish." Captain Reynolds had been impressed by her sincerity. In his long career, he had seen many nobles sentenced to community service, who learned nothing from the experience except how to fake remorse convincingly. Victoria's transformation appeared to be genuine, and he made a note in his report recommending that the court consider reducing her remaining service hours. But when Victoria learned about the possibility of early release from her community service, she surprised everyone by requesting to continue working at the shelter, even after her legal obligations were complete. The work had given her a sense of purpose that her previous life of parties and shopping had never provided. On the day her official sentence ended, Victoria gathered with the shelter residents and staff for a small celebration. These people, whom she would never have noticed in her previous life, had become her friends and teachers. They had shown her what really mattered in life, not wealth or status or social connections, but kindness, compassion, and service to others. Sister Margaret, the elderly nun who ran the shelter, pulled Victoria aside as the celebration wound down. "You know," she said with a gentle smile, "when you first arrived here, I thought this was just another case of a spoiled rich girl learning to fake humility to avoid jail time. But you've proven me wrong. You've become someone I'm proud to know." As Victoria walked home that evening through the same palace courtyard where her old life had ended, she passed the guard post where everything had changed. The same guards were on duty, though they treated her with polite respect now rather than suspicion. She no longer felt the need to prove her importance to them or anyone else. The sword incident that had once seemed like the worst thing that could ever happen to her had actually been the best thing. It had forced her to confront the shallow, selfish person she had been, and given her the opportunity to become someone better. She was no longer Lady Victoria Ashworth, entitled socialite. She was simply Victoria, a person who had learned that true worth came not from what you owned, but from what you gave to others. Standing in the spot where she had once grabbed desperately for a guard's sword in a pathetic attempt to assert her imagined authority, Victoria smiled at the memory of her former self. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone to be pitied rather than envied. The real power, she had learned, came not from demanding respect, but from earning it through genuine service to others.